carried out its constitutional duty to listen to the evidence. The framers of our Constitution placed a heavy and solemn responsibility on this chamber. The House did not come here lightly. We discovered unprecedented abuse in the Texas Attorney General's office by Mr. Paxton. As elected officials, we take an oath to protect the citizens of this state and the sacred public trust. The Constitution charges us with policing our own. If we don't keep public officials from abusing the capacity of their offices, then frankly, no one can. Mr. Paxton's attorneys like to remind everyone that he was elected by 4.2 million voters, but they have blindly ignored the fact that he has ultimately ended up serving one person, himself. Mr. Bangert explained Mr. Paxton's abuse of office in perhaps the most succinct way, and I'll direct you to your screen.
I was deeply concerned that the name and authority and power of our office had been, in my view, hijacked to serve the interests of an individual against the interest of the broader public.
With the help of Jeff Mateer, Ken Paxton was able to build an exceptional executive management team. Mr. Paxton's top advisors were thrilled to go work for him. They came to the office because they believed in him and what he stood for. They were unabashedly conservative, hardworking experts in their fields with rock-ribbed principles. He had hired the best and brightest to help run his office. Mr. Mateer explained at the beginning of trial that these advisors were committed to the rule of law and to conservative governance. In this trial, you have heard from 8 of Mr. Paxton's top and at one time most trusted advisors. There have been several discussions about what the evidence is, but of course their testimony is evidence. Mr. Paxton's advisors were excited about what the office was doing for Texas. They circled around Mr. Paxton and worked diligently to advance the promises that he had made to voters. The travesty is that Mr. Paxton's desire to deliver results for Nate Paul eventually tore the office apart. It metastasized and overwhelmed the office. When it came to Nate Paul, Ken Paxton abandoned and betrayed his trust in knowledgeable staff, his conservative principles, and his commitment to family values, the law, and his oath of office. He repeatedly demanded that his top deputies act as Nate Paul's personal lawyers and not the state's lawyers. He gave the keys to the office. His lawyers have come in here and tried to normalize his behavior. They're not denying that Ken Paxton did any of the acts alleged. Instead, they want you to believe there was nothing wrong with Mr. Paxton ignoring his senior staff's repeated warnings about Nate Paul. Hall of Fame Texas Ranger David Maxwell did not mince words. Your screen, please.
My evaluation of the allegations made by Nate Paul is that they were absolutely ludicrous, without merit, no probable cause, not even reasonable belief that a crime had been committed. The nature of the allegations that he was making were against the FBI, an investigator with the Texas State Security Board, 2 U.S. attorneys, the senior federal magistrate, Mark Lane, and others who were involved in the chain of the signing and execution of the search warrants on his business, his place of storage, and also his home.
Now, it is clear that Mr. Paxton's judgment was completely clouded by his distrust of law enforcement. But his failed judgment does not excuse his intentional abuse of office. Mr. Paxton wants you to find that even though Nate Paul's story was ludicrous, that it was completely fine for him to hire a 5-year practicing attorney as an outside attorney to do Mr. Paul's bidding. He wants you to find that it was completely okay for Mr. Paxton and Nate Paul's lawyer to direct Mr. Kamek to issue grand jury subpoenas against judges, court clerks, police officers, and the spouse of a lawyer involved in a civil lawsuit with Nate Paul. They even want you to believe that going and getting a grand jury subpoena isn't really a big deal. This suggestion is absurd. The ability to issue a grand jury subpoena is a substantial power wielded by our government, and allowing a private citizen to take that power to attack enemies is truly shocking. And Mr. Paxton has admitted that he does not know much about criminal law. When he asked for money from this chamber to settle the lawsuit filed by staff members he wrongfully terminated, he wouldn't even answer a senator's question about the hiring of Mr. Kamek, and instead deflected to a staff member that he said was better qualified to answer. But when it came to Nate Paul and his requests, all of a sudden Mr. Paxton knew best. He refused to reply on the expertise of his staff. He balked at their warnings. And then he hid his actions when he went around them in his attempts to move forward in helping Nate Paul. And he is continuing to claim he knows best. He is sitting here today saying that he was completely entitled to do what he did and that these witnesses were some part of some deep state conspiracy. But once again, Mr. Paxton's claims are divorced from reality. The fact that every action complained of would have benefited Nate Paul is not mere happenstance. As Mr. Paxton's counsel has said, there are no coincidences in Austin. Now let's be clear about what happened here. Mr. Paxton enjoyed the power of his office. He enjoyed his relationship with Nate Paul. It facilitated the life Mr. Paxton wanted. And Mr. Paxton willingly and blindly wielded the power he loved so as to maintain the relationship he needed. This is wrong. The power of the office of Attorney General cannot and should not be handed over to a private citizen to use to attack their perceived enemies. Mr. Paxton claims that he wants the truth, but he hasn't even bothered to be here for the whole trial. He came on the first day, he left at lunch, and now he's here for closing. Clearly, he thinks that he might just get away with this. Had he been here, he could have seen the hundreds of exhibits and the thousands of pages that have been presented to you with 13 witnesses over 7 days that the House have meticulously laid before you. Mr. Paxton put the risk of the citizens of Texas, of the businesses of Texas, and the lives of law enforcement at stake. As the state's top cop, this conduct is and was inexcusable. His actions are precisely the type of grave official wrongs that our Supreme Court has explained merit impeachment. He may claim to be one of us, but unlike the public servants here today, he has no regard for the principles of honor and integrity. He has betrayed us and the people of Texas, and if he's given the opportunity, he will continue to abuse the power given to him. Mr. President, I yield the rest of my time for my closing.
Mr. Busby?
I'm going to get set up here, Your Honor.